tens of thousands of demonstrators in the Washington heat Saturday, protesting President Trump's climate policies on his 100th day in office. The president says he's willing to work with Democrats on health care and other issues. But the top Democrat in the Senate says Mr. Trump must change his approach if he wants help from the other side of the aisle. Joining us now from New York, the Senate Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer. Senator, welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Good to be back, Chris. Morning.
You and the president have been in quite the war of words these last few days. Here's what the president had to say about you last night in Harrisburg.
Schumer is weak on crime and wants to raise your taxes through the roof. He is a poor leader, known him a long time, and he's leading the Democrats to doom.
Weak on crime, raising taxes, leading the Democrats to doom. Your response?
Well, look, the president, name-calling doesn't work. Let's look at values. Let's look at issues. I'd say the president's first 100 days have hardly been a success. He's broken promises to the working people of America, unfulfilled others. You know, Chris, when he campaigned as a populist against the Democratic and Republican establishments. But he's governing like someone from the hard right, wealthy special interests. Let me go over a few areas. On trade, he promised to be tough, backed off on China, backed off on Mexico. On Buy America, again, we have a good, strong bill. They've backed off that. A lot of the steel now and infrastructure and water is going to be made overseas. On health care, he said he'd cover more people at less cost. His bill does just the opposite. And maybe the worst is draining the swamp. His last days, he said, Wall Street won't be in Washington. Well, there are more in this cabinet than others, billionaires. And there's such closedness. I think one of the worst things he did on the swamp is they're allowing lobbyists to work in the administration on issues they lobbied on, and they get waivers that are secret. So there's been promise after promise that's been either unfulfilled or broken. On infrastructure, we sent him $1 trillion plan. We haven't heard a peep out of him. We're willing to work with him on issues like this. So the bottom line is very simple. The president, if he works with us, particularly on issues like trade and infrastructure, we can work. But on the issues so far, taxes and health care, he doesn't consult us at all. He puts together a plan that's very hard right, special interest, wealth-oriented, and then says, the way to be bipartisan is just support his plan. That's not how America works.
But Senator, the Trump White House says a lot of what you say, and this is not new. You've been saying this for a while now. In fact, you gave him an F for his first 100 days. They say a lot of your criticism is just not true. And let's take a look. On creating jobs for the middle class, they note that he has signed executive orders to cut regulations and red tape, pull out of trade deals that he says hurt America, and to build the Keystone and Dakota Access pipelines. On draining the swamp, he's imposed a 5-year lobbying ban on administration officials and a lifetime ban on lobbying for foreign countries. You say he's broken his promises, Senator, but there was a poll out this week, and 96% of Trump voters in the poll said they would vote for him all over again. Only 2% said they would not.
Yeah, well, look, I think it's going to take a while for people to see this, but his popularity ratings, if you want to measure him overall, not just his supporters, but with independents and Democrats, are way down, the lowest of any president. And the point being here is that on so many of the major issues, they've gone at it alone. Have they passed a few executive orders? Yeah, they have. Most of those are studies on into the future. The few that were serious got knocked out by the courts. Have they repealed a few regulations? Yeah, but mainly for coal companies, for companies that want to take advantage of workers' rights. They have broken their promises to the working people of America. And Americans are seeing that. That's why his popularity ratings are as lower than any president in history.
But Senator, President Trump says one of the problems is the constant obstruction by you and your party. You know, back when Republicans were in the minority, you like to call them the party of no. Today, aren't you?
Well, let's take his biggest attempt so far, health care. That wasn't the Democrats. He tries to blame the Democrats, but he didn't need a single Democratic vote to pass it in the House. He couldn't do it. He couldn't do it twice. He ought to realize that they ought to back off repealing Obamacare. We've said over and over again, if he backs off repeal, we'll sit down and work with him to improve Obamacare. Let's look at his next major issue, the tax bill. It seems to be a tax bill that's totally aimed at the wealthy interests. Estate tax, get rid of it. You know how many people pay the estate tax? Only each year, 5,200 of the various wealthiest Americans who have states over $10 million.
Senator,
the pass-throughs, just one more. The pass-throughs on this tax bill would allow hedge fund leaders, top Wall Street lawyers, CEOs of major corporations to pay 15%, while their workers pay 20, 25, 30%. So he is not governing from the middle. He's governing from the hard right. That's why his regime has had hardly any major successes, with the exception of Gorsuch. If he changes, we could work together.
Okay,
but he can't just dictate what he wants, not talk to us and say you must support it. Country doesn't work my way or the highway.
You said one more. We got there. So now let's talk about Neil Gorsuch, because that is probably the biggest legislative issue that has come up in these first 100 days. The nomination of Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court, the American Bar Association and some top Democratic legal scholars said that he was clearly, yes, conservative, but clearly in the judicial mainstream and a distinguished judge. President Obama's two nominees, Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, were both confirmed easily with Republican support. But with Gorsuch, Senator, you led the first partisan filibuster in the history of Supreme Court nominees. That doesn't sound like cooperation.
Well, let me just say this. First, so did Judge Roberts and Alito under President Bush get Democratic support. Gorsuch was nurtured and put forward by the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society. Ideologically, he is so far to the right, and I think the American people will see that as we see his decisions. Let me just say, Chris, you got to let me answer this.
He's no further to the right than Ruth Bader Ginsburg or Sonia Sotomayor are to the left. A conservative president's going to nominate conservative judges. A liberal president's going to nominate liberal judges, as long as they're in the judicial mainstream. Isn't that what an election's for?
Well, both the New York Times and Washington Post hired independent experts to rate where Gorsuch would be. The Times said he would be to the right of every judge but Thomas, the most conservative judge we've had in history. And the Post's analysis said he'd be to the right of that. So this is not a mainstream judge. He comes off as mainstream, Chris.
You got to consider the sources.
You got to let me finish my comment, Chris.
But wait a minute. You're talking about the New York Times and the Washington Post. Neil Katyal, who was a former Solicitor General for the Democrats. The American Bar Association said he was in the judicial mainstream, sir.
Yeah, they said Ruth Bader Ginsburg was in the... They judge by their legal acumen. No one doubts Gorsuch's legal acumen, but his judicial rulings and all his comments in his earlier life show that he is far, far to the right, siding with special interests, corporate interests. The average middle-class person, the only recourse they have is the courts. Gorsuch repeatedly, on issue after issue, has been far to the right. In one case, he even went against what Thomas and Alito said on education of special kids. So this is not a mainstream judge. Appearance is not what matters. It's how he'll rule that matters.
All right. You talked about taxes. President Trump unveiled his tax reform. It's not a whole plan. It's the outline of a tax reform plan, principles this week. Here is how Treasury Secretary Mnuchin explained it.
What this is about is creating jobs and creating economic growth. And that's what massive tax cuts and massive tax reform and simplifying the system is what we're going to do.
Senator, the government just announced that in the first quarter of this year, the economy, GDP, grew by 0.7%. That's the slowest rate in over 3 years. Doesn't this economy need some more growth?
Yeah, it needs growth, but it does not need to give the wealthiest people in America a huge tax break. Mnuchin said himself a few months ago, the Mnuchin rule, that the very wealthy would be tax neutral. In other words, the loopholes they'd close on them and the things they'd take away would be the same they gave. This tax plan is not like that at all. In addition, it adds anywhere from $3 to $7 trillion to the deficit. Many of our Republican friends who railed against the deficit when President Obama wanted to help middle-class people or the poor people are saying that this is okay. I think it's going to cause huge problems for America. If you aim tax breaks at the middle class, we're fine with it. If you aim them at the very wealthiest who are doing very well so far, God bless them, that's not going to work. It's not what America needs.
But Senator, here's what you failed to mention in your critique of the tax plan. The president's plan would also double the standard deduction. As you can see, we've got it up on the screen, from $12,000 to $25,000 for a married couple. 70% of Americans, mostly low to moderate income earners, take the standard deduction, and they would benefit from that doubling of the standard deduction. This would be a tax break for them.
Well, but he also takes away things like the mortgage interest deduction, the state and local property.
No, that's not true. He does not take away the mortgage. No, he does not take away the mortgage interest deduction.
You cannot do it if you use without the standard deduction. He takes away state and local as well. And middle-class people get far less of a benefit. Many of them were hurt. One estimate said that millions would pay more. And the rich do extremely well. They seem to get 95% of this tax plan. That is not how Donald Trump campaigned. It's another broken promise. That is not what the American people want. That is not what the American people need. When you rush through a plan like he did and put it on one page, it's not going to be very good, and this shows it.
Senator Schumer, thank you. Thanks for joining us today. And I just want to say, I do not believe that you are leading the Democratic Party to doom, sir.
Thank you very much, Chris.
That's all I'll say, but I will give you that.